airplanes are a hip mobility exercise that we can do to help bring the pelvis into its full range of motion. So we want the pelvis to be able to shift both into internal rotation and external rotation on the femur. This is usually pretty helpful if you're having any sort of SI joint pain, because sometimes it can be related to a mobility restriction within the hip socket area. So to start, I'm going to hold on to something. Eventually you could progress to not holding on to anything to make it more like a strengthening and balance exercise. But for the purposes of our programming, we're typically using this exercise as a hip mobility routine. And so doing it without holding on to anything is not usually necessary to progress towards. So I'm going to put weight into one leg, and then I'm going to reach the top leg up. So if you're familiar with yoga, kind of like a half moon pose. So my feet are going to be perpendicular to one another. So this foot is facing forward and this foot is pointing towards the wall in front of me. I'm going to feel kind of a stretch here in my groin. So this is bringing my hip into an open position or into external rotation. So I would stay here for about a second or two, feeling in that stretch in that groin area. And then I'm going to begin to rotate towards the opposite side. So I'm going to bend in my standing leg and to bring my hip into internal rotation or a closed hip position. So bringing this opposite hip closer towards the standing leg. I'm going to feel a big stretch in my standing leg glute now. So rotate to open up. Feel this stretch in that groin, pointing the toe forward in my open hip externally rotated position. And then I'm going to rotate to face the opposite direction, bending in my standing leg to feel that big stretch in the glute. So what it looks like from the opposite side. So standing on my leg, feeling it more in that standing leg groin, so open hip position. And then I'm thinking rotate my pelvis on top of my femur to face the opposite direction. So again, feeling this big stretch in this glute. When I rotate this way, the standing leg is going to bend and then open back up, feeling that external rotation and stretch in the groin area. And then rotate to close the hip, come into internal rotation, big stretch here. So again, holding on to something is usually pretty helpful. Now, if single leg movements are really uncomfortable or balancing just on one leg, we can regress down towards the floor with side plank rotations. So with side plank rotations, I would take a Pilates ball, a yoga block, or like a small pillow, and I would put it between my thighs. Then I would come down into my side, and I want my elbow, my hip, and my ankles to be in a generally straight line with my knees a little bit more forward. So I'm going to be in this straight line position with my knees ahead of my hips and the rest of this line. So from here, I'm going to exhale to push my hips forward to find full extension in both hips as I squeeze this ball. So I'm going to exhale to find that full hip extension as opposed to pushing my hips towards the ceiling, where you can see I still have flexion in both my hips. So it's kind of like an up and out type motion. And then from here, I'm going to take my top elbow and I'm going to bring it down to my bottom wrist. And then coming back up and then sitting back. Exhale, squeeze the ball as I extend both hips and then reach with the top elbow down to touch the hand and then come back up. So this is a little bit different from the standing position, but I'm still stabilizing a little bit more in that bottom leg. And then as I rotate, I'm bringing this hip into a more closed hip position and then coming back up a little bit more externally rotated and then back. So it's not going to be as intense as the hip airplane, but it's a good modification to do if standing just on one leg and pivoting around is really uncomfortable. But the hip airplanes and the side plank rotations are both hip mobility exercises that we can do. And the side plank rotation is going to add a little bit more thoracic rotation, which sometimes can also be the culprit to some of the issues and pain that we